Hello and welcome to Noni, Yanga's flagship talk show where we discuss all the hot topics. Today we look at the surge in interest of African literature, and as we're beginning to see many on-screen adaptations of these popular stories, we ask how important is it for the narratives to stay true to the culture. Joining me today, novelist Dr. Chibundo Onuzo, writer Ola Awanubi, and writer and motivational speaker Amaka Chika Mbono. That was a mouthful for me. Hi ladies, nice to see you. Authors such as Chinua Achebe and Buchi Mcheta paved the way for African authors with award-winning works including Things Fall Apart and Second Class Citizen. Today there's a new wave of thematically diverse fiction led by these ladies here and other big names including Chimamanda Adichie and Ben Okri. Are Western readers finally gaining access to a greater variety of titles? Now, let me start with you first, Amaka, because how to get your wife to swing from the chandelier in a negligee, that's definitely a greater variety. Tell me how you started writing and why a topic such as that.
Well, I've always written from when I was young. It's just something I've always been interested in, but actually had published work about a year ago. And I just came about that because I'm particularly interested in the institution of marriage, which I feel forms the bedrock of everything. Anything anyone wants to be is going to start from a home. And so I just wanted us to take a relook at what everybody thinks about marriage and how it should work, because it's obvious today that marriages are in trouble.
See, that kind of title, that's a title you're definitely going to see in a Waterstones or your local bookshop.
Yeah.
But do you think people are surprised that an African woman is writing about such a tale?
Well, it's funny because the Africans are, I don't know whether it's politically correct to say this, but one seems to think as if they're kind of in the dark ages. But so much has happened in Africa now. And in my particular, like in Nigeria, so much has happened. So no, I don't think people should be surprised that I'm writing about swinging from the chandelier in a red negligee.
Do you swing from the chandelier in a red negligee? I don't think my weight can hold that. I'll ask you that off camera.
Well, what I'll say is that the red negligee is kind of like I don't know, something that indicates a freedom to just be yourself.
Ola, you've written a series of short stories. You're award-winning. How do you get a short story about African culture, which is so rich, into so few words and pages?
Why don't you start with the emotion, you start with the story, you start with the trajectory and what you're actually trying to say. Really, you're just telling someone something in a really short amount of time. But it's basically something that I had to work out and work out and work out, because, as I'm sure Chibundo will understand, trying that whole art of trying to put a short story together is more difficult than just writing a novel, because you've got so much to say.
How do you define whether it's a short story or a novel? And when do you kind of strip back? Do you kind of write a novel and then keep cutting down things, or like how do you define it?
You just start with the short story. It could just be an incident. Just on the way here, maybe you happen to see a couple on the train talking to each other and she's crying. That's a short story there that you can just write. Just a short story telling the story of...
Okay, it's as simple as that.
As simple as that.
I'm sure it's much more harder than the way you make it, but of course you are an award-winning writer. Dr. Chibundo,
yes,
now doctor.
Put the sauce
I'm going to put the
name.
DR on top of your name. Congratulations for your graduation, by the way. But I must say, and I don't want to play down luck, but some people would say you are one of the luckiest, youngest, emerging African writers living in the UK. You know, your books have been picked up by the best publishers. Welcome to Lagos was a fantastic, fabulous read. Tell me a little bit about your journey, how hard it was and how you've managed to stay an African writer but living in the UK.
Thank you. Well, I don't think I really have a choice in being an African writer. I'm an African, so yeah, I have to remain that till I die. But I guess my journey, so I started writing The Spider King's Daughter, which is my first novel, when I was 17.
Wow.
And I'm now 27. So I've kind of been like 10 years in the industry. And I'm taking part in another panel discussion similar to this, but looking back on publishing in England. And at first I was kind of like, I'm too new in my career to be on this sort of panel. And then I was like, hold on, I guess I've been doing this for 10 years.
Time, yeah. And I'm sure you were writing before that.
And I was, yes, I was writing before that. So even though I'm some people might see me as young. I've been around for quite a while, actually.
You have been around for quite a while, but writing, even though I think most people, our viewers, would say everyone's got a book in them. You know, everybody's gone through experiences, whether good or bad. Like you were saying, Nola, you can be on the tube, see something, you want to capture it, but it's difficult. And even those that do publish, you know, self-publish, find it very difficult to get an audience and somebody to read it or to finance themselves. That's why I would say you're lucky. Do you think that it can be very difficult, especially people of colour who are writing, to find an audience?
So I agree, yes, everybody may have a book in them, but not everybody has the tools to get it out. And then that's where, you know, the writing and the craft and all of that comes in. I would say it's been a good journey. I remember for my first novel, when I would go to speak at literary festivals, you know, there would be literally nobody in the room. And it's very funny. It's when you have to give a presentation to literally nobody and you're answering questions that you've prepared answers for and there's nobody there. And that definitely happened at the start of my career when I was a debut novelist. So it's nice now sometimes, you know, to do an event and people come.
People show up. I've seen there hundreds of people. Do you think that's got something to do with being African, or is it just because you're a debut novelist?
So a lot of my audience actually is not African. I don't know, I wouldn't say that a lot of my readership is not African, but often when things like the big literary festivals, when they're promoted, they don't, I don't know how it happens, but the audience often, it's not made up of black people, it's not made up of African people. But it doesn't mean that these readers are not there. It's that somehow it's not connecting. They don't know that these events are happening. They don't know that
we've
there's
discussed
content.
it time and time again. Sometimes it is accessibility and people just not knowing. Have you found that, Amaka, that, you know, even with talking about marriage, the people that are reading your books are not necessarily an African audience?
Well, the thing is that charity sort of always begins at home, and I kind of straddle two worlds, you know, I kind of straddle two worlds. So I think you always have to start from kind of what you know and the people you know, and then your community, and then you stretch out. So for me, my audience has been mainly African, I think. Mainly because a lot of the analogies and things I use are African in my books.
Chandelier and the
including the chandelier, I'm telling you, yeah. So I think right now I am gaining a lot of audience that is not African, but I did initially start with Africans. I mean, I've been published for just a little over a year, to be honest. Do you understand? Although I've been speaking about marriage for a long time. So I'd say I've started African, but it now begins to stretch outward. And I think one is always going to start from, I guess, their origin to some extent.
Of course.
Yeah, from what you know, sort of thing.
And then it spreads out from there. Ola Chibundu said, Dr. Chibundu has said that, you know, she's an African, she'll be an African until she dies. Do you consider yourself an African writer, or do you just consider yourself a writer?
I'd just like to consider myself as a writer. I'd like to consider myself as a writer. Considering myself as an African writer, it's not necessarily a bad thing per se, but what I'm thinking is that our books shouldn't just be consigned to the black section of bookstores.
Why not? Do you think it's limiting? If your books, your short stories are about the African experience, surely that's the section of the bookstore that they belong.
The African experience is a universal experience. It's love, joy, pain. It's a universal experience. Whether you're in Burma, whether you're in Birmingham, whether you're in London, whether you're in Paris, it's a universal story. So you wouldn't necessarily classify Dan Brown and put it under, you know, under an American
Western
English.
Under
Western English. So in some ways it is limiting. In some ways it is limiting because, as like with Chiamanda's books, it's a universal story. So why does it have to be just under that?
Before we go to break, it's good that you mentioned Chimamanda. Chibundu, would you say that Chimamanda is an African writer, or is she now just a world-class writer?
I mean, I don't.
In the industry, how would they define her?
I mean, it's the two terms are not mutually exclusive. You can be a world-class writer and still be also be, it's not a still, and also be an African writer. I know why people shy away from the term, because sometimes they feel that if you say an African writer, people expect a certain sort of story from you, a story of war, poverty, or whatever. But we who are African, we know that to be African is to be something that's limitless. So I don't know why I don't shy away from the
We're
the
African, but not African writers.
I'm an African writer.
You're an African writer.
Yes.
Still to come, we continue this discussion by looking at film adaptations. See you after the break. Welcome back to Nonny, with subjects exploring violence against women, polygamy and the rise against militant groups. African writers have not shied away from controversy. Is there a growing appetite for fiction that affects issues on the continent? Chibundu, let me come to you first, because Welcome to Lagos, you know, that's the book of yours that's out at the moment. It explored lots of different issues that are bubbling in the capital, well, not the capital, the former capital, but in the city, including corruption and poverty. When you were writing that book, were you writing for Lagosians? Were you writing for Nigerians, for people on the continent, or was you writing for everybody?
Well, I was definitely writing for myself, first of
Okay.
all, because you're your first reader. When you write, you know, you're the first person who reads the work. And I think I'm not necessarily targeting an audience, but I like it when I have Nigerian readers. I like it when somebody who knows Lagos, it's not even about someone who's Nigerian, somebody who knows Lagos reads the book and says, you got it, you know, that
scene or that character.
Exactly, that definitely makes me very happy.
Ola, who do you write for? Because of course, you know, if you're a writer and you're a full-time writer, you want to make money. And sometimes if you've got a big publisher or you've been given royalties, you know, towards something, do you tend to see, and do you yourself feel like you will be writing to please a publisher or writing because you know that that's going to sell? And can you understand people who do that?
I can understand people who do that. I think you might start off trying to write for a particular market or trying to keep to the publisher's brief, but in the end, you're writing for anyone who wants to read, who sees that story and says, yeah, I can identify
as Chibundu said, it's about writing for yourself first, and then whoever is going to enjoy it. And Maka, you know, some would say writing can be quite elitist. Elitist per se, you know, if you want to make money from it and if the publishers are going to take on your writings, you've got to be very well connected. Do you find that people on the continent who are craving these stories don't just want to see it on a headline in a newspaper, don't just want to read about it in social media, but want some context? It's very difficult for them because some African writers are shying away from writing about those topics purely because they want to impress the mainstream.
I don't think anybody should write to impress the mainstream. In fact, my experience has been that in order to write, you need to write about something you're passionate about. You need to feel the story. You need to live the story. For someone like me, marriage is not African, neither is it European, neither is it Asian. Marriage and the issues surrounding marriage and the issues involved in marriage are universal. The pain of, say, infidelity, the wanting someone who loves you for you, the wanting to be a companion to someone and have that person be a companion for you, it's universal.
You're right, it is universal, but then I belong to a book club that Chibundu was lucky. I was lucky enough for Chibundu to invite me to. But we've read some stories about love, but the African way of telling that love story is completely different. If you're talking about infidelity, the way an African woman, you know, may relate to her partner is very different than the way it would be in the mainstream or in the West, right?
Who is the mainstream? Why, if something is African, why does it then become outside the mainstream? There are many streams in the world. There's not just one stream.
Of course, and that's kind of the reason why we're having this Nonny discussion and why we invite women like you onto the show. But, you know, going back to trying to please your audience, let's take Americana, and we do love Chimamanda, and because she is so famous and so popular, that's why we refer to her so often. But some were saying Americana, washed down, whitewashed. Some of the things that she was talking about had no relation to the black community. Did you hear some of these critiques? Do you think we were being harsh because she's popular and she's someone that can be dragged down, or was she trying to please the publisher?
No, but the problem is not Chimamanda. The problem is the publishing industry, because what happens is, if there's only one big book by an African author in a year, everybody wants to see their experience reflected in that book.
Yes.
You know, it's not an encyclopedia, it's a novel. You cannot have every experience.
You can't please everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you need many Chimamandas. Then if you don't like Americana, you put it down and then you go and read Welcome to Lagos.
Now, from Half a Yellow Sun to Beast of No Nation, African stories are making their way onto the big screen. As on-screen entertainment is a powerful source of engagement, how important is it that the DNA of these stories stay true to the culture? Now, I've seen many films that are from, you know, an African DNA or from an African novel, and you're like, actually, no, that's not true. Or why was that taken out? This woman is too light. are we being too harsh? I know Hollywood obviously have these issues anyway, and most people that are a lover of a novel, if they see it remade, they're kind of critiquing it. But there's something, isn't it? Or surely, or maybe I'm just putting it out for you to give me your opinion, about the African story. When that's interpreted, there's always something that's drastically wrong.
I remember watching half of Yellow Sun, and obviously watching it and thinking, well, it's just a certain kind of, you felt as if the meat of it had been kind of stripped back a bit. It's, most stories, when you adapt them, can't stay actually true to the but you. I still feel there could have been more done to it. So I came away feeling slightly, hard done by. It's such a great story, and it says so much about the civil war in Nigeria at that time.
Of course, Half a Yellow Sun was so controversial. Even in Nigeria themselves, it was banned from the cinemas. They were scared there were going to be riots because, of course, it spoke about Biafra. And, there are still wounds. People are still healing. And, Chimamanda, she's great in being able to talk about it. But they had a fear. And then, of course, when it came out, people were saying, actually, these characters aren't right. Why didn't we have enough of Nollywood stars? Genevieve, they thought, had a very small role where she could have been one of the main actresses.
Yeah, she could have been. Definitely could have been one of the main actresses. But the thing is, it's money. He who pays the piper which is why it's excellent that people like Mo Abudu are coming up with Ebony Live TV and with the films like The Wedding Party, because when you start writing the checks, then you can start saying, I want Genevieve, I want Omotala, I want so and so.
But do you think it's because they couldn't afford? They could have afforded her.
It's not that they couldn't afford, but they thought this movie won't sell in America it won't sell in Britain if Genevieve and Omotala are the faces.
See, it's interesting you're talking about it wouldn't sell. Does that ever get down to books where, you are let's say you are a big star, you are Dr. Chibundu, you're selling your books, the publishers have noticed you. Is there then a pressure where they say, we really want another book, but, less of that, more of this, take out these characters. We've had directors on that are saying they've written scripts and it's about a black person or, a black taxi driver, and they're like, let's just take that out. Do you think that can happen?
I think it does happen. I really think it does happen, but I think it's only going to be changed by the kind of things that are being said here, that more of the African people are getting into these areas. For instance, like The Wedding Party, which was, for me anyway, was a phenomenal movie. As we get more into the mainstream, to put it in, like we said, like Chibundu said, there are multiple streams, but as we get into, let me use mainstream for want of a better, better word.
West.
Yes, as we get into more of that, yes, then we can dictate the tune. Because it really, if somebody is paying you for a publisher, unless you're, say, a John Grisham or something or whatever, then maybe you've sold so many books that you can then tell the publisher, no, I'm going to go in this direction. But if somebody is paying you to do something, chances are you might have to go down the road of what that person wants to a large extent until you can dictate that tune. You understand? That's why self-publishing, I think, is kind of a way to go, even though there are difficulties with self-publishing because of the distribution and all that. Yes. But yeah, if you want to a large extent retain the integrity of what you're writing, that might be a way to go.
Yeah, that's a really important part, in maintaining the integrity. Chibundu, I'm sure you're writing your third novel at the moment. Has the publisher ever told you to stop writing something or cut back on this or add that?
No, they haven't. But actually, well, maybe sometimes with Pidgin, I can have back and forth with my editor about what is understandable and what is not. But again, hearing this conversation about big checks, the words of Davido come to my mind. I want to know. I want to know.
You want it.
For me as a writer, I'm definitely trying to look for ways to diversify my income from writing. So I am obviously working on my next novel, but I'm also doing the show at the South Bank on the 21st of October, where I'm trying to look for ways to bring my two passions and interests together.
I think that's important. I think it's good for an African author, any author, to diversify. I think the problems you may have from people who are not, they haven't made it. They're just watching. They're relying on people like you. They're relying on Chimamanda, Ben, to tell their stories, is that they do want that DNA to stay the same. And it's so important, especially considering there is a surge. Africa is trending, which is a popular Nonny term. But then because it is trending, we just want to make sure that those right stories are being told. We want to make sure that that person who's playing that lead character does look like the lady that's been described in the book. So even though you can understand that, well, you know, they've got to pay the bills and, you know, stop blaming them when there should be more of them. There is still, you still have to be a role model, don't you? You still have to hold your position to account.
No, I reject that idea because, as I said, and well, I reject that idea because it's buying into the fact that we're an ethnic minority in this context. Nobody is telling the people who create these stories that you have to tell the definitive story of Africa. And as a writer, I refuse to accept that burden.
Really? So you
Yes, I
don't?
refuse.
So you don't feel a responsibility, Chibundu, to tell a story that you know a lot of white people are going to be reading? Do you feel responsible at all for telling the narrative of your people?
So in my journalism, so I also write for The Guardian, and then also, I guess I'm a historian as well. I have a non-fiction side of myself where, you know, yes, then you're looking for balance, then you're looking for, you know, objectivity and so on and so forth, or you're trying to anyway. But as in the fiction side of my brain, my responsibility is to the characters, the integrity of the narrative, the language, the dialogue.
I think I kind of agree with
Yeah,
that,
the
you know.
craft.
That was a really good story. Bunch of storytellers here. Well, that's it from me, Juliana Olayinka, and my fantastic guests, Chibundu, Ola, and Amaka. And don't forget, Nonny's now online. Wherever you are in the world, go to www.yangatv.com to check out every single episode. Join me next time for more Nonny Chat. Goodbye.